like to introduce you to Lewis Emery Jr. You may not recognize this portrait, but you certainly know his name. The Emery name is plastered all over Bradford, and with good reason. I'm not exaggerating when I say that Lewis Emery Jr. was probably the most amazing man that ever lived in Bradford. And back in the year 2000, when the Bradford era was writing a story on the millennium, and they asked me who I thought was the most influential person that ever lived in Bradford, I didn't have to think twice. It was Lewis Emery. And we are going to look at Lewis Emery in this edition of Coffee with the Curator. Now, Emery was an oil producer, of course. Everybody probably knows that, and it was said that he owned over 1,000 wells in his lifetime. But he also owned wheat plantations, ranches, hardware store, oil well supply stores, pipelines, refinery, lumber, and his own newspaper, the Bradford Daily Record. He also owned gold mines and a rubber mine down in Peru. A man for all seasons, definitely. Lewis Emery Jr. was born in Cherry Creek in Chautauqua County, New York, on August 10th of 1839. His parents moved from New York State to Hinsdale County, Michigan, when he was really young, and he grew up there. His father, Lewis Emery Sr., owned a woolen mill, actually owned two of them. And after Lewis Emery got out of school, he learned the details of the woolen manufacture, taught school himself, and jointly with one of his brothers owned a flour mill. The mill was sold in 1864, and he moved to Illinois, where he engaged in lumbering and farming, and then decided to come east. And when I say he came east, I don't mean he came to Bradford. One of his first stops was at Pit Hole, and this is a photograph of that early city. In 1865, he drilled his first well at Pioneer in Pennsylvania, and for the next 5 years or so traveled around the oil country. 2 of his 5 children were born in this period. Clara Louise, who was born in 1865 but died a year later in 1866, and Delavan, born in 1867. In 1870, the Emerys relocated to Titusville, and he remained there for the next 5 years. It was here in Titusville that he lost his fortune when a financial panic in the oil world caused Lewis Emery to incur financial obligations which he could not pay. In the oil field talk of the day, he went to the wall and lost his fortune. This is a photograph of Lewis Emery taken about 1880. He would be about 40 years old. He had 3 more children by this point. Grace Elizabeth, born in 1874, Earl, born in 1875, and Lewis Emery III, born in 1878. The fact that Emery had lost all his money never fazed him. It was said he was a man who didn't know when he was whipped, but he learned from his past experiences in the oil field and never looked back. He had often viewed the hills of McKean County with a strong suspicion that they held a lake of petroleum beneath them, and in a spirit of desperation, he determined to test his ideas. He leased and purchased about 14,000 acres of territory without a cent of money. The people had confidence in him and trusted in his ability to pay, and never questioned it. He commenced operation in this field on July 28, 1875, on a farm called Toad Hollow, about 2 miles south of Bradford. That well produced about 40 barrels of oil a day. It wiped out his debt completely and set him on the road to financial success. Lewis Emery and his family would remain in Bradford for the rest of their lives. And in May of 1883, Lewis Emery purchased a plot of land on Congress Street and built this impressive mansion. And here is an up-close photograph of the mansion with Grace Emery sitting on the steps. And if you don't remember ever seeing this mansion, It's because it was torn down after Lewis Emery died in 1924. It had been purchased by Forrest Dorn, who tore the old mansion down and built a new house in 1926. This is the Emery hardware store, built about 1875. It was located on Main Street, and today the Mercantile is located there. Many Bradfordians remember the Emery hardware store, even though it closed over 50 years ago. Lewis Emery also had his own oil refinery, established in 1888. The refinery was sold to the Tidewater Pipeline Company in 1929. This postcard of the refinery gives you some indication of the size and scope. An article in the Industrial Recorder of 1903 said that 35,000 barrels were refined every month. The plant covered nearly 7 acres and was located on the BR&P Railroad near the Fisher Dam, which today is Mill Street. The buildings are all made of brick and comprise a spacious barrel house, shops where the tank cars, boilers, stills, etc. are made and repaired, and warehouses. The works are thoroughly equipped with machinery of the most improved pattern, and everything is kept in the most scrupulous order. You probably recognize this building. It's the headquarters of the Bradford era newspaper here in Bradford. But it was originally Lewis Emery's office building, built in 1919 under his personal supervision. This building remained the headquarters of the Emery Empire until March of 1939, when it was sold to the Bradford era newspaper. Lewis Emery was also involved in politics. He was a state representative, a state senator, and ran for governor in 1906. At the time, he was 67 years old and ran on the Lincoln Republican ticket. He lost that election by only 56,000 votes. Perhaps what Lewis Emery is best known for, though, at least in the oil world, is his fight against Standard Oil. He became a symbol for the independent oil producers, not only in Bradford, but throughout Pennsylvania. In the late 19th century, John D. Rockefeller owned Standard Oil Company, and he was determined to control all the oil production in the United States through a monopoly with the railroad. Lewis Emery determined the best way to get his oil and other independent oil producers to the seacoast was to lay a pipeline and organize the United States Pipeline Company in 1892. Emery proposed laying a dual pipeline that would carry both crude and refined oil to a friendly railroad, one that was not controlled by John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. He first planned to lay a pipeline to Reading, Pennsylvania, where oil could be transported to the seacoast by the Reading Railroad. As it turned out, the Reading Railroad was already in the pocket of Standard Oil, so a new plan had to be made. But Emery had foreseen this possibility. Believe me, there are many exciting stories about the laying of the pipeline and fighting Standard Oil's men to get it through. But eventually, Emery succeeded and got his pipeline to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, where a friendly railroad, the Jersey Central, carried the oil to Bayonne, New Jersey. In a book by Ida Tarbell called The History of Standard Oil, she wrote, "To the astonishment of everyone, Emery and the Independents had laid a crude line 180 miles long, connecting the Bradford oil fields with a friendly railroad, but also a refined line 250 miles long, connecting the refiners of Bradford, Oil City, Titusville, and Warren with the same railroad. A tremendous accomplishment." Emery had many other accomplishments during his life as well. He donated the first steamer to the city of Bradford to help fight fires, gave $1,000 to Alfred University as a scholarship. He helped build the First Presbyterian Church, served as first president of the Bradford Hospital, and later helped contribute to the equipment and the building fund of the Carnegie Public Library. He also traveled extensively. In 1879, he went to Europe and made a thorough investigation of the oil fields of the Baku region of Russia to learn, if possible, what the competition with American oil would bring. In 1881, he went again to Europe and visited Germany, Italy, Turkey, Greece, and up the Nile of 1,000 miles. He collected curiosities and mementos of all these travels and formed them into a small museum which he donated to the Bradford Library. And he also wrote detailed accounts of these travels and sent them home in letters to be published into the newspapers so that others may read of his travels. Lewis Emery died in November of 1924. He was 85 years old. Newspapers throughout the state marked his passing. It was said Emery's death on November 18th of 1924 signals the close of a long, productive, and challenging life. He was a vigorous and uncompromising foe of wrong, a sincere champion of fight, a noble, stalwart man, a man whose life and labors must fully amplify the real true American in the finest meaning of the world. Following his death, his daughter Grace Emery built the Emery Hotel in his honor in 1929.